Hello everybody, it is Mike Levin on Tuesday, August 31st, 2021, and I was thinking I would not do a video today into my podcasts and such as I was on this trip to pick up my kid, in particular listening to the Search Off the Record stuff from Google, and a little bit of Talk Python to me from Michael Kennedy, and it's resonating in my head, it's bouncing around in there, that my ability to do things, to actually implement and do things at basically little to no cost from like a web hosting perspective is at a all-time high. So one of the big changes I did recently, well, first of all, the background to all this is how can you very well call yourself an SEO, a search engine optimizer, if you don't have some sites out there, if you don't have, quote, some skin in the game. Now, in reality, I'm not making revenue off of almost any of my websites except maybe for these YouTube channels as a YouTube partner. But you can't very well go saying do this and do that to, a high-end publisher. My employer, for example, is one of the largest small publishers. J2 Communications is the holding company kind of umbrella to it all. But most people know it as Ziff Davis. Ziff Davis with a bunch of properties like IGN for video games. The gaming community knows IGN, and then there's PC Mag, which goes way back, and it was like a competitor to Byte magazine in like the 80s when I was reading the paper versions of these things. So I work for a company that has publications with roots. Ziff Davis itself goes back 100 years, and its publications included its version of what we would know today as Asimov or analog sci-fi magazines. So this stuff is like really dear to my heart. This is the kind of place where the short stories from like Isaac Asimov appeared. Now, it wasn't on the Ziff Davis version of it, but they had one of those sort of pulp fiction style, comic book like things from back in the day. And I'm working for that company. How cool is that? How much better aligned to your vibe could you possibly be? Not that I really even subscribe to those types of things and read them anymore, but there was a phase, there was a time when I did, and that sort of campy sci-fi has a special place in my heart, as does sci-fi and science and technology in general. We also have Mashable in our properties. So I have to speak on issues, maybe a little less so lately in how my data mastering skills have been used for other purposes within the company. Also still quite valuable, but as a pure SEO role, I've seen the last of those days quite a long time ago. I've sort of transitioned into being a more general purpose, I call it data master. Now, there's a funny thing going on in the industry now, and I talk about this with my counterpart who's in a master's program for analytics, for statistics. It's a highly valuable thing. It's part of almost a criteria for machine learning and artificial intelligence stuff, and is one of those obstacles I have between me and a certain class of machine learning projects I would very much like to do, where you can do auto categorization of web content to create tags, that sort of thing. Auto categorizing content is really the classic example, because one of the first things you start talking about is your training model. Is it a guided training model where you say these things are quality or these things are cats, and you sort of make these, first sets of training groups and relationships yourself? Or do you leave it to the data to emerge, to just group similar things, groups you would not have thought of creating, and you might not even understand their nature when you first look at it? So I understand all these things intellectually and abstractly. I have not used the machine learning stuff in real everyday work, except in a handful of special one-offs that were not very large ongoing data samples sets that sort of grow and improve with the sort of life learning, learning over time, nature that these things are supposed to have. Hence the cloud and the next coming of the vendor wars and of slipping in dependencies and reliances. All these platforms, and they're very nice. They let you do some very amazing things. They're, stupid cloud tricks, in the early 20s, the 2020s, where you can build up websites from your favorite JavaScript framework with, Node.js cloud backending from usually Google with their cloud platform, but also you could do this stuff with Amazon Web Services, or almost, you choose your poison. You can do this with a wide variety of web hosts. Are they web hosts? Yes, I guess ultimately they are web hosts, but you're trying to really get out of the picture. You don't want to have to run your own code and do your own, hosting like ye old days of the LAMP platform, Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP, where you most frequently spun your own physical server hardware. You built servers yourself. The game modding community, like the IGN crowd on YouTube and such. There's this love of the hardware. Tom's Hardware, another publisher, not one of ours, but there's this deep, intense love of the hardware that used to be in at the server level, where you got all these magic numbers and you would build these wonderful RAID arrays and break up the, functionality of your app across different physical hardware, one for the database, one for the application. And there was a love in it. There was a real love in it. And that went away when came the clouds. And also, if you do it yourself, the servers aren't so big. You can do it from Raspberry Pis and SSD drives on like a Lego motherboard these days. It's a different world we're in. And so the love, shifted from the hardware to the implementation, to how you did it. And there are a number of implementation choices these days, and many of them lock you into the vendor-provided solution, the Google Cloud Platform, Microsoft Azure, what have you. It's, in my mind, not a great place to be, because they close you in, and while you can perform wonderful magic tricks, you can only do it on their stage and their way, to the extent that they make available, and you can't go off the beaten track, and you can't do all this crazy hacking stuff, which, if it's going to be short-lived anyway, why not be short-lived with none of the limitations that keep you from hacking? Why make it short-lived in a proprietary island? Sometimes accessibility and permissions and familiarity is the answer to that. So yeah, never taking it off the table, but don't want it to be me. So where things are me is where the knowledge and know-how are rapidly reusable, coupleable together in different ways, where the interface, or the API, the application programming interface, is really everything. And the way you wire things up is through text files. You create text files, you put them places. Sometimes you have to point things to those text files. Sometimes you have to set certain permissions. But these text files run the show of, say, a system booting up. They can be the INI files, or I guess they're XML files, whatever they are these days, of the systemd system that goes in the directory that controls which services start up when a Linux system boots. So that's the way it really is on all Linux systems these days, with the exception of maybe Arch Linux and Gentoo Linux. There's a few out there that have not embraced the old systemd approach, but so long as it's on the new convention for Linux, system administration, system access and control, you can sort of step in and make what you want happen as the system boots up, just by the presence of certain text files and what they say. So you master that. You master putting text in text files and putting text files in certain places, named certain ways, giving things certain permissions, and so on. And you eventually become the master of text. Being the master of text comes before almost all else, because so long as you can do these tricks, you can master everything else in the chain. Now, there's a lot of advanced tools out there, and they are appealing, and they're powerful, and they're great power tools. They let you do more equivalent work faster. So why not take up a better tool if it lets you do more work faster? So the answer is you do take up those tools, but you take them up with the, due caution. The knowledge and know-how you're accumulating, while some bits and pieces of it may transition over to future development platforms and execution platforms, the great majority of it is just going to be thrown out work. But then isn't stuff you're doing today on whatever platform du jour you're doing anyway, isn't it always just throw out work? Well, no, not really. Not when your language is so stable that whether or not to add one sort of conditional walrus operator can tear the organization apart and make the founder step down. Python has, to an incredibly large extent, stabilized. It's on version 3.10 now, moving on to 3.11. And 3.10 has its features locked. Anything new is going into 3.11, so it's in the release candidate phase of 3.10, which has a few neat things in it, like those pattern matching things, a bunch of stuff I actually really want to get to. I have to get to the walrus operator and the pattern matching. But these are not volatile things in the Python platform. And so when you master text in, say, a Vim text editor, where almost nothing's going to change as the decades tick off. Now, I know a lot of you out there are on VS Code, and you got to take up the power tools. So much work is being put in by Microsoft to ensure that you're on VS Code. They're attacking that vulnerability because Microsoft is determined to own the developer stack, the developer chain. No matter how much you want to fancy yourself a free and open source person, you're going to be on Microsoft tools at some point sooner or later, if for no other reason than the best hardware is the cheapest. And once you get the best hardware at the cheapest in the stores with all that touchscreen and all, it's deeply ingrained with the drivers and all these customizations in the hardware, to the extent that you really cannot or do not want to nuke the place from orbit and put Linux on that desktop. Say Ubuntu Linux, which has a decent selection of drivers, but now you're going to be in that eternal mess of being off the beaten track of all the money and resources that's trying to keep your PC running well, running modern, running with the latest, not going to be going into instead into that operating system that you just dumped because you had some sort of allergy to proprietary stuff. So we all stand on the shoulders of giants, and those shoulders of those giants are black boxes, which we very rarely know much about the internals. We maybe know a little about the internals. The old Commodore engineers used to burn their metal from sand. They used to burn their silicon from cutting it out with X-Acto knives from Rubylith and photo, reducing that down to the actual etching for the silicon chips. They knew what was going on inside the hardware, and it's still a big thing now to know every bit and every register of the 6502. When the Maker Faire was a thing here in New York City, one of the more popular exhibits was a blow-up of how the 6502 chip works and how you can in fact know almost everything going on in a piece of hardware. It was special days. Those days are long behind us, and at some point, even the most intelligent people, even the people who are most detailed and pedantic about knowing what's going on in their hardware down to the silicon level, can't know everything and have to take a certain amount at face value, especially when in come the optimizations and the caches that are swapping out things on you, I/O, because they're fetching it from somewhere faster because they know they're going to be fetching the same thing a second time, so cache it. And with all these, different techniques of caching and optimizations built into the hardware at this point, things happen faster often than you would think possible. And you don't always know the play-by-play reason for which that happens. You have to take it on faith, take it at face value. And it's a very humbling thing. However, it does free you to start treating this stuff as if it were almost a type of magic. Our smartphones are a kind of magic wand for communicating out to the world. And people can comment back. I could almost do this as a live stream. I've considered experimenting with live stream on the drive because 5G, it would already have been broadcast by the time I stopped, instead of having to go to YouTube, select the video, make the title and description. I could have done all that ahead of time. And then by the time I was done, it would be broadcasting. There might again be some sort of cache. Live broadcasting in packet world and TCP/IP world is never really live broadcasting. There's packets being bundled up and sent out over, routing that could follow different paths. So, there are a few protocols layered in over IP, the IP protocol. TCP is one of them. The packet exchange, but there's also UDP instead of point-to-point. TCP, IP, UDP. It's a broadcast format where the same bit stream is sent to everyone on a network, and everyone can tune into that bit stream, and it would be no real additional cost, from a network traffic and work perspective. Everyone's seeing those bits flying by anyway. Why not just tune them in? So I don't know how much of that is really implemented these days over the internet, but it seems like it is, because boy, does streaming work well. Wow, with a nice broadband connection over, cable these days, you can just stream over HBO and binge watch or whatever your channel and poison, and you hardly see any hiccups. Sometimes there is, and sometimes it is connected to other people also doing things in the home. So there you have a little bit of insight. Bits are bits, and you can only fit so many bits into a network before there is some performance, impact. But it does go to show you, with how little performance impact there generally is, how much excess capacity is really built into everything these days. We're paying for this incredible broadband, and we do it to just stream down movies. We're not doing any of our own in-home hosting. No one almost does that anymore. There's too many security risks. It's a bright flashing beacon saying, hey, here is servers you can get to. Speaking of which, one of the ways to avoid the cloud is by using a NAS, Network Application Storage. So it's a little computer that usually has a bunch of bays for drives, so you can plug in a lot of drives to create these RAID 1 and 0 arrays type things. I'm just doing 2 drives for a simple mirror, but nonetheless, you get that without a lot of thinking. You plug it in, it goes through a wizard, and bam, you've got the storage part of NAS, Network and Application Storage. You've got the storage part, but to get the application part, these computers, they're actually little computers, and they can host apps. So these companies like QNAP create these web user interfaces like the old web hosts had, the cPanel with the web hosts, but now it's all this cPanel looking stuff that's running right out of your home off of your NAS. And these things have been attacked. They've been hacked. There's been QLocker and a bunch of other things that have compromised the data on all these NASs around the world. And I was sitting on one of these for a long time, but it was still in the box, not set up, not plugged in. And I probably dodged a bullet by having dragged my feet for so long. But now that I finally have set it up and am using it, I have it basically cut off from the internet. It's not even reachable. The QNAP people released a new firewall app that I'm using. I'm getting rid of the software, like the synchronization software, until I need to use it for that. I probably will at some point in the future. But I'm pulling off everything that is, a hack vulnerability surface area. And I'm having, fewer number of retry attempts for a longer duration of timeouts, and all these things that are the precautions to take your local NAS more secure so that you can use it for cloud stuff. This is your place for running your database. This is your place for running local instances of, Jekyll or WordPress or anything like it that you want. It actually has its own little version of Kubernetes. Now, you don't have to be on Kubernetes to get the benefit. You can have a container farm and plug in different containers and start them running without all the technical overhead and liability of a Kubernetes cluster. And it ain't even necessarily Docker, because there's a Linux standard for these virtual containers. And they might be like, oh, Linux is just copying off of Docker. Well, Linux has been doing, and Unix has been doing this kind of stuff forever, ever, with a trick called chroot. Managing resources and changing where things are loading from is nothing new. Docker just packaged it well and marketed it well, and sometimes the nuance, the details of the implementation does in fact make all the difference. It is very important. So Docker showed the way, just like Apple so often shows the way in what became Systemd on modern Linux. Apple did that first on their Unix system to solve that same set of problems. This developer, I forget what his name is, took the ball and run with it, and now that's what Linux uses. So that taking the ball and running with it happens a lot, and then systems spring up and you sort of evolve around these things, and makes for a viable platform to do most of the things you're ever going to need to do in life, and allows you to get better over time because stuff doesn't change on you that quickly. However, there is a big, steep learning curve to overcome. And this is the place where I think I can do the most good in helping people. This is why I'm starting these video series again in earnest. I've been doing this on and off from I think 2006. I've been on YouTube back that long. You can go back and see some of the first things I pushed out. But, I've sort of wavered and wandered over time. But the latest thing is, thanking goodness that things like pandas have become mainstream, and that their APIs are mainstream, and that SQLite has joined the ranks of regex, regular expression matching, to just always be there and to be almost an interoperable language and file system. So all these things I need to do and have always needed to do as a webmaster: manage content with some sort of content management system, push it out and publish it, track the results. I can do now using my existing stack. And while I won't be running code on the web server, I sort of breathe a sigh of relief. I'm going to be using GitHub's Git.io system, GitHub.io system, or GitHub Pages as they're coming to be called, which gives you publishing for free. They do the hosting, and they use the Jekyll system on the back end to format your markdown, but you could just put plain HTML there. So I'll hook into different, usual suspects, take up the standard best practices, Google Analytics, Google Search Console, and kind of do my thing. There's a little question how I'll do other database back-ending, how I'll do user feedback and comments. I'll probably just end up driving people out into Twitter to hold a conversation with me in Twitter and to get it out there into the community, to get rid of having some sort of comment system built into my website. But then I could probably render out the Twitter threads as a built-in, user contributed static content, because I won't just be using Markdown and HTML. I'll be using probably Jupyter notebooks to manage each website, to do the tender love and care, the pruning and trimming, and page generation on occasion of each site. So Jekyll might transform Markdown, but say I want to take my one long journal file, which I actually do use on each site, and dice it into the paginated blog format that is supported by Jekyll. And I have a Python script do that. Where does that run? Well, it runs on my local system. Well, that's sort of silly to have that bound to your own personal laptop that you have to go in and run every once in a while. Well, because it's Jupyter Notebook, it's also just plain vanilla Python, which could be on a headless server. Oh, so why not put it on your NAS system, your QNAP, on a instance of Ubuntu spun up under their Kubernetes-like container host? Oh, okay, yeah, I'll do that. Do a little basic SQLite stuff there. Do a little scheduled stuff of Jupyter Notebooks that you have upgraded to a scheduled task so that you're always paginating and spitting out your linked together network of pages according to your scheme, whatever it is that you have 100% personal control of because you invented those scripts. So there's a little bit of not invented here, but then you lean into the strengths of the tools. Jekyll, which is a Ruby application, which is doing something similar on the back end to keep those pages published, transformed from the Markdown to the formatted HTML. So there's some scheduled task or auto-sensing of new documents. There's something going on the GitHub back end, which is similar to what I'm talking about doing with Python scripts on my back end, running on my NAS. So in this way, you push the complexity around. You do things in the easiest, most natural way possible, so you are only ever personally working in your sweet spot, working in your zone. You're doing the kind of work that lets you step out of time and transition into that love-worthy place that keeps the creative juices flowing, that keeps you being spontaneously expressive, and which allows you to, say, copy and paste content between your different websites by just copying and pasting between different text files, which you can do in Vim without ever even taking your hand off the keyboard. So you write one thing in your private journal that doesn't get published, you can copy and paste those text blocks out into one of the journals that does get published in the reverse chronological order. There's three ways that time happens. There's three ways to frame experiences, to keep records of them, to process them in your mind. One of them is sequential, the way life happens. Now, sequential itself is kind of terrible when you're trying to, say, do blogging. So the modification on pure sequential is reverse chronological, the latest at the top, but then you type down. And then you start a new blog post, latest at the top, and then you push down. So you got these segments that you create at the top, pushing down. So it's newest, older, and then, you know, oh, I guess it does get older all the time, reverse chronological, except at that moment when you start again. Okay, so anyway, sequential order is one of the great orders of our time. Unix time is ticks since 1970 when Unix was invented, and it's an absolute measurement. Any clock showing the time in Unix, I believe it's UTC, Universal Time Code, Unix time code, will show the exact same number at the exact same moment, no matter where that clock is, you know, with the exception of relative time dilation effects. Those clocks will be in exact synchronization with each other. So, the next way to organize time and things in your mind and information is hierarchially. There's a lot of ways you can push and twist that hierarchy around into what looks like flat lists. So it's a flat list, it's not hierarchical. No, it is hierarchical, it just has one hierarchy, one level of hierarchy called a bulleted list. That's a hierarchy. But nonetheless, when you start to move things around and map them and make them relative to each other, either through indenting or through actual mapping it around as diagrams on a page, that is organized and mapped information. So there's sequential, there's organized, right? Which is almost like an editorial statement. Like, who's to say what is the organization for the world or whatever? So that was like the battle between the early days of YouTube, when it was a human-edited web directory, versus Google, which was pure search. And of course we know pure search won because human-edited can't keep up with the pace of change. And machine learning is now chugging away at those quality issues that search doesn't do as good of a job as human editors. In time it will. So that solution is gradually coming online across the world, where search systems are starting to take on the intelligence of human-edited systems, right? We're seeing that play out now. That's a big part of my field. And what else? So I need to know a bit about those machine learning systems. It's been years already, but you know, I'm doing in my way. I'm working through my statistics stuff, and I have you know, everything I need now to run it locally without a cloud expense, so I can do more frequent and smaller experiments. And I'm using the Google APIs a lot. I'll always be tapping into, you know, those APIs because, you know, the usual suspects of tools, not the least of which is Google Analytics and Google Search Console. But then also tools like AdSense and all things YouTube, and the A/B testing. I'm going to actually do A/B testing. I'm going to figure out how to use Google's optimized product hand in hand with the GitHub IO Jekyll pages, GitHub pages. So I'll have my sites essentially self-optimizing one way or another, not self-optimizing as if, you know, without an eye towards quality, because there are systems you can make crazy feedback loops that really do self-optimize in a very real way. And I'm not going to be doing those spam cannons, spamming engines, you know, page cannons, or whatever you want to call these things, are part of the past, and Google is very much against them, as well they should be. And back in the day, I created a tool called HitTail. It had a 15-year run in it. It was a web app that was around since the Web 2.0 days. HitTail, a writing recommendation engine that basically taught you how to lean into what your website's trying to tell you will perform well on your site. So if you write about that, you're pretty assured to grab the first page of results in Google. Now, things aren't really so much that way anymore, but similar things do exist. You're always still getting some search hits for something, and that is always still your toehold, your beachhead, such as it were. And so I'll be rebooting that, the whole hittail and hittailing and long tail optimization process. So you have that to look forward to on these channels. And I'll be bringing, I call them channels on these websites, I'll be bringing them to life one after another in rapid succession. Mostly not monetized, just to have skin in the game from a, you know, traffic and metrics perspective, but maybe monetized if it's really that easy to do it, the same way it is on YouTube through AdSense. And master the Jekyll system. One more thing to have to learn, but it's a templating system, just like the Jinja templates or whatever. So yeah, anyone can always take up one new templating, you know, curly bracket, pointy bracket, %sign templating system that's always used in conjunction with web systems, so that you can work mostly in HTML or Markdown, and then sprinkle in some conditional logic or variable replacement or the other kind of stuff you want to do in that environment, so that you can make web navigation and stuff. I'll also pick one of the frameworks that would work really well in this context. No server backend processing, no Node.js on the backend, but certainly the local JavaScript interpreter in the browser, JavaScript engine in the browser. And so one of these framework things is going to be just what I need to cut my teeth on a little bit of vanilla JavaScript, see what's going on under the hood. And I'm leaning towards Svelte. Svelte is looking and feeling to me maybe a little bit different than the others like React and Vue. However, it has the one key point going for it, that what compiling it does into vanilla JavaScript instead of for some other, yet another framework-oriented runtime engine, which React and all the others seem to have. So again, proprietary, that's sort of roping you in and locking you into some proprietary thing, when at least with Svelte you can transcode it to vanilla JavaScript and go, oh, okay, that's what it's doing to maintain state and to swap out images or whatever. So, yeah, there's JavaScript in my future, but in exactly the same way that there's regular expressions in my future, and there are everything else that's built in to the web as these subsystems. So JavaScript engines, the whole browser itself, is kind of built in as a little subsystem of technology that you have to learn how to talk to. But in the same way you had to learn how to talk to PostScript devices in the past, the world changes. And the world is going to change again, and everything that you're doing today on the web framework, on the web as the platform, is going to be different tomorrow. And some things will carry over, but instead of that language that started out so pure and easy to use 30 years ago, derived from the ABC language, with Python, is going to be based on a language that is, inspired by the curly brace languages of C and Java, and then has all this interesting syntax being sort of layered in and twisted and accommodated for, in a way that Python really has not had to do that much lately. In the past it has. It did with list comprehensions. List comprehensions sort of wedged in a way that no other syntax or tokens was using that space. So list comprehensions sort of came in sideways into Python, as did single line anonymous functions, lambda functions, and a few other things that work in sort of unexpected syntactical ways in Python. But Python sort of used most of them up long ago. JavaScript is in the process of using those new spaces to have curly bracket list logic, to have different scopes for local variables, and a number of other things that are features of Python that are now being brought to JavaScript. But in my opinion, in syntactically more difficult way, I have to refigure it out every time. And I'm having difficulty taking up JavaScript and keeping it in my mind. It's not a natural fit. It's not my vibe, such as it were. Whereas Python totally is my vibe. I have an easy time taking it up. I can hold it all in my mind at once. And I rarely have to look up how things work again, which, sustaining that over time and time again, in fact, extend that over a whole lifetime, all that intuitive clicking makes for a love-worthy environment where you can be spontaneously expressive and yet control the machines. And so that's a pretty good place for me to be wrapping up here. I had a great time talking to you. It's always fun, and I hope to talk to you again soon, and don't forget to subscribe.